Hi everyone, welcome to our first lecture of chapter 26. This is actually effectively our last lecture of the semester. We do have one more lecture after this, but this is our last lecture that presents new material. So after today, we will have covered all of the new material for our course. In our next lecture, we are going to be doing a case study that is going to kind of summarize a lot of what we've done in this chapter and our urinary chapter, but it will not present anything new. So let's start with our not really attendance questions. First, a pH of 5.3 is classified as. Next, a pH of 5 has blank times blank H plus, then a pH of 7. Next, name two organs that function to adjust body pH. Next, as CO2 increases, pH blank. And as pH decreases, kidneys blank H+. Go ahead and pause your video, try to answer those questions. Hopefully you've done that, so let's take a look and hopefully you can see a trend. Everything here is talking about pH because that's really the primary topic of today's lecture. So a pH of 5.3 is classified as acidic. Remember, anything below 7 is considered acidic, and anything above 7 is considered alkaline or basic. 7 exactly is pH neutral. A pH of 5 has blank times blank H plus and a pH of 7. Well, first let's unpack what this question actually means. Remember, pH is a measurement of H+. It's a measurement of proton concentration, and protons are H+, or hydrogen ions. So we're talking more or less. So does 5 have more or less H+ than 7? Weirdly, the pH scale, the lower the number, the more H+. So 5 has more H+ than 7. But how much more? Each whole number downward is a 10 times increase. So 6 has 10 times more H plus than 7. 5 has 10 times more H plus than 6. 4 has 10 times more H plus than 5, and on and on and on. So 5 has 10 times 10. So 100. 5 has 100 times more H plus than 7. You don't add them, you multiply them. So 10 times 10 is 100. Name two organs that function to adjust body pH. Hopefully these are fresh in your mind because we've covered them both pretty recently. First, most recently, the kidneys. The kidneys adjust your body's pH. And second, the lungs. The lungs adjust your body's pH. Both of those are going to come into play today. As CO2 increases, what happens to pH? Well, remember, as CO2 increases, H plus also increases. And as we just said, as H plus increases, pH decreases. So as CO2 goes up, pH goes down. As pH decreases, what do kidneys do to H+? Well, as pH decreases, body H+ goes up. So if pH goes down, there's more H+ in the body. The kidneys want to get rid of that H+. So kidneys will secrete H+ into the filtrate so that we can urinate it out. If any of those did not make sense, make sure to go in and review them before proceeding with today's lecture, because today's lecture is going to apply all of that. So, part of what is in this chapter is electrolytes. You do need to know table 26.1. We are not going to devote lecture time to it, but you do need to know that table. It's a pretty good sized table. But what you need to know is the normal range for those electrolytes. You need to know what happens to cause those normal ranges to change. So, for example, sodium. What could cause sodium to be high or low? And if sodium is too high, what happens in the body? Or if sodium goes too low, what happens in the body? Okay, so what we're going to be talking for the rest of this lecture is about pH. So let's go ahead and get started with that. We're going to be talking a lot about pH in this chapter, and we will repeat ourselves several times. This is a chart from chapter 2, or a variation on a chart from chapter 2. And just to kind of refresh a few things, pH is a measurement of H plus concentration. That's what pH tells us is H plus proton concentration or hydrogen ion concentration. Those are all the same thing. H plus, proton, hydrogen ion, those are all the exact same thing. And not only is it a measurement of concentration, the numbers actually tell us a little bit more. And it's kind of weird to read the chart because the lower the number, the higher the H plus concentration. The way that they get that, we won't go into. It's called a reverse logarithmic scale. But really what it is the lower the pH, the higher the H plus concentration. And it runs from 0 to 14. So we see down here at the bottom, 0 pH. And it gives some examples of everything along the way. And it runs up to 14. 7, right in the middle, is considered pH neutral. Acids are anything with a pH less than 7. And if it's above pH 7, we call it a base, or in this chapter I'm going to refer to it more often as an alkaline. So base and alkaline are interchangeable. I will be using the word alkaline more often. Anything higher than pH 7 will have a lower H plus concentration, or any higher pH at all will have a lower H plus concentration than a lower number, but bases, as we go up above 7, they will have much lower H plus concentration. So, acids, low number, pH, high number, 7, right in the middle. Acids low, base high. I think I just said pH high. Acids low, base high. Now, up to this point, every time we've talked about numbers in this class, I've told you not to worry about the numbers, that you don't need to know them. In this chapter, we're going to change that. In this chapter, there are going to be some numbers that you do need to know. And the first are the pH values in the body. You do need to know the normal pH, and it runs from 7.35 to 7.45. And that means our body is slightly alkaline, slightly basic when everything is functioning correctly. Everyone seems to come in thinking that since 7 is pH neutral, that our body is pH 7, that our body is neutral, and that's not the case. We are naturally slightly alkaline. Now, a pH less than 7.35 in our body is considered acidosis. That means our pH is too low. A pH greater than 7.45 is considered alkalosis. Our pH is too high. But that creates a little bit of a weird issue. For example, let's look at pH 7.2. If we looked at our pH scale, 7.2, it's above 7, so it's an alkaline. But it's below 7.35, so that's considered acidosis. Even though in that instance, that number is an alkaline, it's considered acidosis because it's too low for our body. So there is a little bit of a weird area there. Now, if we have a normal pH, then it means that our body must have a way to keep that pH within a certain range. And there are a few mechanisms that it uses to do that. the fastest of which is a buffer system. Remember in chapter 2, a buffer is just something that resists change in pH. And they're very, very quick. These buffers work within just a matter of seconds or even less than that. There's several buffers within our body. The first one is the bicarbonate buffer system. And when we learn these buffering systems, you do not need to know the mechanisms. I won't get into the chemistry of it. What I do want you to know is where do they function. And the bicarbonate buffer system, we've already seen how that works back in respiratory. And the bicarbonate buffer system buffers in both the ICF, the intracellular fluid, and the ECF, the extracellular fluid. But it's the only important ECF buffer. Next, the phosphate buffer system buffers the urine and it buffers the ICF. And the protein buffer system, which actually there are several proteins that act as buffers, and they all work a little bit differently based on their amino acids. Remember, each protein is made of a sequence of amino acids, and different proteins just have a different sequence of amino acids. So different proteins that buffer will buffer differently based on what their amino acid combination is. For example, we saw back in respiratory that hemoglobin is a buffer. It buffered the inside of our erythrocytes. Remember, we saw when H plus goes up that hemoglobin would bind it, and that would help buffer our red blood cells. So let's take kind of a break here and look at a thinking cap question. Why do we take antacids? So let's work this through and first think about when do we take antacids. We take them when we have an upset stomach, when we have heartburn, something like that. So why do we take them? What's going on when we have an upset stomach or heartburn or something? Well, our stomach creates various enzymes and it creates acid. And that acid helps to break down the food that we eat, and sometimes that acid irritates our stomach lining, sometimes where our esophagus and our stomach meet at the gastroesophageal junction, sometimes that cardiac sphincter fails and the acid moves up into our esophagus, and our esophagus isn't equipped to handle that acid, so it starts to burn near our heartburn. Antacids are buffers. Really, they're alkaline, but they can buffer stomach acid. So we take antacids, which are alkaline, in order to help ease the pain of something like heartburn. Another method to maintain body pH is respiration. We saw in the respiratory system chapter that we breathe at the rate and depth that we breathe to adjust our CO2, which ultimately adjusts our pH. So we breathe to adjust our pH. This is a little bit slower than the buffer system. It takes about 1 to 3 minutes to have full effect. And you can kind of go back and review chapter, was it 22? Yeah. Go back and review that chapter if you're unfamiliar with that, but hopefully by this point everyone's familiar with how breathing and CO2 and pH are all related. Finally, our kidneys. Now, our kidneys can adjust our body's pH, but they are much slower. This is the slowest of the methods, but it lasts longer. It's long-term. Kidneys can take hours to a couple of days to adjust our body's pH significantly. And there's several different ways that they do that. The tubules can filter more or less bicarbonate ions. I think that wording is kind of weird. Tubules can reabsorb or secrete more or less bicarbonate ions. That's a better wording for that. Tubule cells can generate bicarbonate ions as needed, and they can secrete more or less H plus as needed, but that's a lot less significant. It's really the bicarbonate ions that the kidneys maximize use of regarding pH. If you are too alkaline, your kidneys will get rid of more bicarbonate. If you're too acidic, your kidneys will generate and reabsorb more bicarbonate, because bicarbonate it's in addition to being a buffer, it is an alkaline. So if we increase the bicarbonate ion concentration, we increase pH. So now the rest of this lecture is going to talk about ABGs, which stands for arterial blood gas. And now some of you may be familiar with these. Most students, when they get here, they might have heard of them, but they're not really familiar with what they are. And it's going to be kind of covering pages 933 through 938. But I'm going to cover it very, very differently. I cover it different than your book does. I cover it different than other instructors. I cover it different than your programs will. Because when I got here, I did not like the way that this was taught. So I kind of developed my own way of doing this. And I think ultimately it makes it a whole lot easier. It just takes a few tries before it actually starts to click. So when we're doing ABGs, these are going to tell us quite a bit. One, it can tell us several things about what issues a patient has, and it can also tell us how is their body responding to these issues. And like I said, you do need to know the numbers in this chapter. So here are all the numbers that you need to know. You need to know that pH range, 735 to 745. You also need to know the normal CO2 partial pressure, 35 to 45. We mentioned that back in respiratory. And you need to know the normal bicarbonate ion concentration, which is 22 to 26 milliequivalencies. So as we said, with the abnormalities, if your pH is less than 735, we say you have acidosis. If it's above 745, we say you have alkalosis. But there are different types of these, and they're named because of what is actually causing them. For example, if you're having trouble breathing, then it's a respiratory problem, and it's either going to raise or lower your CO2. And as we've already talked about multiple times, CO2 directly results in pH changes. In the case of when we check someone's ABGs, their arterial blood gases, if their pH is low, below 7.35, and their CO2 is high, above 45, well, that tells us that that elevated CO2 is what's causing the low pH. So we say they have respiratory acidosis. If we check and we see that their pH is high, above 7.45, and their CO2 is low, well, that low CO2 is what's raising their pH. So we say they have respiratory alkalosis. At the same time, we could have metabolic problems that are causing these pH imbalances. If their bicarbonate ion on their ABG is low, that can result in low pH. So we say they have metabolic acidosis because the HCO3 minus is generated through metabolic processes. So we just refer to it as metabolic. If their bicarbonate ion is high, then that can raise their pH. Because again, remember, bicarbonate ion, while it is a buffer, it is an alkaline. So if it's high, then the pH will be high. We say they have metabolic alkalosis. So here are everything that we just mentioned kind of summarized in one chart, but we will come back to those here in just a little bit. The next thing we'll talk about today is compensation. So if you are having a breathing problem and it's changing your pH, then other parts of your body can help with that. Or if you are having metabolic problems, then your breathing can help with that. Compensation is when one part of your body picks up the slack from another part of your body. For example, if metabolic processes fail, if you go into metabolic acidosis or alkalosis, then your lungs, your respiratory system, can pick up the slack and try to bring your pH back to normal. Or if your respiratory processes fail and your CO2 gets too high or too low, metabolic processes, specifically your kidneys, can pick up the slack and help bring your pH back to normal if breathing was the problem. And we'll see that in action here in just a little bit. So what are some things that could cause each of these conditions? In respiratory acidosis, anything that increases CO2 in your body to above normal. Well, remember, we breathe. With every breath, we get rid of CO2. So if we're not breathing enough, if something's interfering with our breathing, then CO2 remains in our body and it builds up. For example, COPD, emphysema, asthma. And on the other hand, we have respiratory alkalosis, anything that decreases CO2 in your body below normal values, such as hyperventilation. If you're breathing too much, you're blowing off excess CO2, and that low CO2 can cause you to go into alkalosis. The metabolic problems are a little bit different. Metabolic acidosis can result from something like prolonged diarrhea. Now, this is not, I got an upset stomach and had to rush to the bathroom real quick. No, this is prolonged diarrhea, so several bouts of this. Let's look at why prolonged diarrhea can lead to this. We said that in your stomach that acid is produced, and it's doing that to break your food down. But once that food is broken down into chyme, and that chyme leaves your stomach into your duodenum, from that point on, we need to protect our digestive system. It doesn't handle really acidic contents very well. So one of the jobs of your pancreas is to secrete bicarbonate into the duodenum, where it mixes with that chyme to buffer it. And as that partially digested food moves through your intestines, nutrients and that bicarbonate will be absorbed into your bloodstream. But in the case of diarrhea, it's moving through your intestines much too quickly, so we don't absorb nutrients and water, and we don't get a chance to reabsorb that bicarbonate back into our body. So we're losing bicarbonate too quickly in the case of prolonged diarrhea. And if we lose that bicarbonate, which is alkaline, it leaves our body in a state where it is too acidic. If we lose alkaline, it leaves us acidic. In the case of diabetes mellitus, we can go into something called diabetic ketoacidosis. The same thing with starvation causes ketoacidosis. So in the case of diabetes mellitus, what actually happens is the glucose that's in your bloodstream, you're not able to absorb it into your cells so that they can use it for ATP production. Your cells then believe that you are starving because they don't have access to that energy. They think it's not there. So when you're starving, what happens? You start to break down fat, you start to break down muscle protein. And when you break down fat and muscle protein, it produces things called ketones or ketone bodies. And ketones are acidic, so they leave your body in a state of acidosis. On the previous exam, there was one of the optional short answer case studies where a guy was lost in the woods, and when they found him, he was breathing differently, and I asked why that was, and a lot of people didn't make that connection. Even though we hadn't introduced these mechanisms yet, I did give you enough information, and maybe you were one of the ones who answered this. Let's see why that happens. This person was starving. He had been lost in the woods for a few days. When you're starving, you start to go into ketoacidosis because you're breaking down your fat and your muscle, and that was included in the question. I asked, why was he breathing differently? Well, he was breathing differently because his pH was too low because of those ketones. And that would have been his lungs trying to compensate for that. But starvation causes ketoacidosis. Excess alcohol ingestion. Drinking a lot of alcohol can drive you into a state of acidosis. Metabolic alkalosis can come from something like prolonged vomiting. Well, in this case, when you're vomiting, food is coming upward from your stomach, where it's got that acid mixed in with it. It hasn't yet left your stomach into your intestines. So in this case, instead of losing too much alkaline contents like diarrhea, vomiting leads to losing too much acidic contents. And as that acidic contents leaves your body, then it leaves you too alkaline, drives you into alkalosis. And again, this isn't just, oh, I got sick. This is prolonged vomiting. This is several bouts of vomiting that drives you into the state of alkalosis. We're going to get this sheet. This sheet is what I'm going to go through, and we're going to work through some of these problems together. Now, using this sheet, like I've said, across the top of your paper, when you're going to do ABGs, across the top of your paper, in this order, write pH with the normal values underneath. Next to that, write CO2 with the normal values underneath. And next to that, write bicarbonate with the normal values underneath. You do need to know those numbers. I won't give them to you. Once you've written them in that order, alternate the words acid, alkaline, acid, alkaline in the spaces. And it has to be in this order for this to work, because once you get this, it's going to do all the work for you. Now, draw an arrow to each of those words. And what that tells you is anything with a pH less than 7.35 is acidic. Anything with a pH greater than 7.45 is an alkaline. With CO2, anything less than 35 is alkaline. Anything greater than 45 is acidic. Bicarbonate, anything less than 22 is acidic. Anything greater than 26 is alkaline. And then, for each one of these problems, you will be given a pH, a PCO2, and a bicarb. And from that, you should be able to tell me what type of problem does this person have and how is their body responding to it. So we're going to go through several of these together. I think I have 6 or 7 practices that we will work through together. And once we get rolling, I ask that you try to work ahead of me once I give you the numbers. And for the first few, like I said, it might be a little confusing. For some of you, it's going to come a lot quicker. For some of you, it might not come quite as fast. But by the end of it, I think everyone here should be able to do these really quickly, and you might even get to the point that you enjoy them. This is one of the things that I enjoyed quite a bit when I was learning it. So let's go ahead and look at our first patient. We get our ABGs, and they have a pH of 7.51, a PCO2 of 30, and a bicarb of 25. Now, once you have these numbers, here's how I recommend solving these problems. The first thing after we've drawn our chart is to just look at the pH. Ignore everything else and just look at the pH, which is 7.51, and we go up to our chart. Where here does 7.51 fall? Well, it falls above 7.45, so follow our arrow, and that tells us this is alkaline. Now, before we do anything else, what we already know is that this person has alkalosis. The pH tells us that they have alkalosis. But that's not everything we need to do. Next, we're going to look at the PCO2 and the bicarb. The PCO2, 30. Well, that's below 35, so follow our arrow. That says alkaline. Go down to our bicarb, says 25. Where's that? Well, that's right here in the middle. So it's normal. It's not on either side. It's normal. Once we've filled out our pH, we got our condition, alkalosis. Now we filled out the next two things, one of them is going to match the pH and one of them is not. So let's go and see which one it is. pH says alkaline, which other says alkaline? The PCO2. Which system does CO2 correspond with? It corresponds with our respiratory system, whereas HCO3- is a metabolic process. So, respiratory matches, that tells us respiratory alkalosis. What kind of things cause PCO2 to be low? Something like hyperventilation can cause respiratory alkalosis. And the final thing that we will do is look to see which one does not match the pH. In this case, bicarbonate. It says normal. When we see that it says normal, that tells us that there is no compensation occurring yet. There's a pH problem. We know that it's caused by the breathing, but the body has not yet started to try to pick up the slack. There's no compensation occurring yet. Now, if we come back later, we may see these numbers change and we may see compensation start to occur, which we'll see a little later. So let's go ahead and erase these and try some more examples. Now I'm going to go through quite a few examples, so go ahead and keep trying these along with me. Next, pH 7.53. That's a 5. PCO2 of 40. And bicarb of 32. Remember, look at our pH, nothing else, and see what does that tell us. Go ahead and try this on your own and see what we come up with. So the pH 7.53 is alkalosis. Then we look at the other two. PCO2 40 is normal, and bicarb 32 is alkaline. So what does that tell us? The PCO2 is normal, the bicarb is alkaline. Alkaline matches with pH. So this person has metabolic alkalosis. And the PCO2 saying normal tells us that there is no compensation yet. Metabolic alkalosis. What kind of things can cause that? Something like prolonged vomiting. Okay, let's try some more. Now, if I'm going through these too quickly, if you don't get them right away, watch this part of the video several times. Try them a few times until they start to click. I promise they will. Next, pH 7.26, CO2 49, bicarb 24. Well, what's the first thing that we do? You tell me. We're going to look at that pH. 7.26 is below 7.35, so this is acidic. That tells us what? This person has acidosis. Look at the next two. PCO2 49 is acidic. And bicarb, what does that tell us? Bicarb 24 is normal. So can you tell me the rest of this condition? CO2 matches with the pH, so this is respiratory acidosis. High CO2 is causing low pH. Something like asthma, something like COPD. And the bicarb is norm, so what does that tell us? That tells us that there is no compensation occurring yet. Okay, next. And you guys can find several of these online if you want more practice. All you have to do is just Google ABG problems. I'm sure that there are many of them out there. Next, 7.26, CO2, 49, bicarb, 37. Let's go ahead and try this first on your own, and then go back and see pH 7.26. That's over here, so that's acid. This person has acidosis. PCO2, 49. That's acidic. Bicarb, 37. That's alkaline. So let's see, what does this mean? Well, which one matches the pH? The CO2 does. So that tells us this person has respiratory acidosis. Again, something like COPD, emphysema, asthma. But now we see for the first time the one that does not match the pH. It doesn't say normal anymore. It says abnormal, but it's in the opposite direction. This is compensation. The lungs are failing, so the kidneys are trying to pick up the slack. What do the kidneys do? They start to generate and reabsorb a lot of bicarbonate. That's why we see the bicarbonate is elevated. So what do we call this? This is respiratory acidosis with partial metabolic compensation. What does that mean? Partial compensation says that something is trying to pick up the slack. In this case, the kidneys are trying to pick up the slack from the lungs. But they have not yet fixed the pH problem. The pH is still abnormal. So they haven't completely fixed the problem. That's why it's partial compensation. And we want to specify that it's a metabolic compensation that's occurring. Lungs are the problem, respiratory acidosis. Metabolic processes are in the process of fixing the problem. Partial metabolic compensation. Let's keep rolling. pH 7.23, PCO2 30, and bicarb 19. Try this one again on your own, and then we'll go through them together. First, the pH is acidic. So this person has what? They have acidosis. Look at the other two. The PCO2 is alkaline. The bicarb is acid. So what else do we know? This person has metabolic acidosis because the bicarb says acid, and that matches with the pH that says acid. What else do we know? Well, the PCO2 does not say normal. It says alkaline. It's the opposite of the other two. So that is partial respiratory compensation. Now, we get to this point, and usually there's the same question that comes up, so I'm going to go ahead and address it since you guys can't ask questions in real time here. What happens if all three of them say acid or all three of them say alkaline? Well, whether or not that's even possible, I don't know. I've not gone into medical classes that far. I would assume that it's probably possible, but by that point, there's a lot of other bigger problems going on. So, in this class, you will not see all three of them say acid or all three of them say alkaline. That won't be something that you see. Let's do just a couple more, and then we will wrap up for the day. And again, try these several times, and then try some of them online, or try those that are on your ABG quiz that, like I said, you can download it already. It's just we're going to have to answer it on Blackboard, which I'll create here in the next few days. All right, pH 7, pH 7.41, CO2 40, bicarb 23. Go ahead and try this one on your own, and let's see what we get. pH 7.41. Well, that's normal. That's actually right within the range. And PCO2 40, perfectly right in the middle. And bicarb 23, also right in the middle. That's great. What does this person have? Well, I always say this person has health. This is exactly what we want to see. The numbers are all normal, so we can stop there with that guy. And one final, pH 7.36, CO2 48, bicarb 30. Try this one on your own. We see 7.36. Look up here, that's normal. So we can stop there, right? pH is normal, so everything's dandy. But let's go ahead and look at the others just so that we're being thorough. PCO2 48, that says acid, so that's kind of raising a red flag. How can that be acid, but the pH is normal? Let's look at the bicarb of 30. Well, that says alkaline, so that makes it even more weird. So pH is normal, but neither of the other two are. Well, that's a special scenario. So there's a few things that we have to do differently. Let's go back and we see that since these two are both abnormal, now we're going to drop back and look at our pH again. Even though pH is normal, the other two are abnormal, so that means something is up. Instead of allowing that to be normal, we go right back up and see 7.36. Yes, it's within the normal range. But what is it closer to? It's closer to the acid end. So we're going to call it acid. And we will treat this just like our other problems. This is an acidosis because pH says acid. Which one matches? That would be CO2, so that tells us this person has respiratory acidosis. And then we look down to see this other abnormal. That's going to be a type of metabolic compensation. But in this case, it is total or complete metabolic compensation. Total compensation or complete compensation says not only is one part trying to compensate or pick up the slack for the other part, they've succeeded. Remember, the point of compensation was to try to get the pH back to normal. In this case, they did. It worked. We have complete compensation. Now, this compensation, it doesn't fix the problem. It doesn't fix the cause. It just brings the pH back to within the normal range. There's still the underlying issue. In this case, respiratory acidosis. We've said a few times now, that's something like COPD or asthma, something like that. So the underlying problem is still there. It's just we've fixed the pH imbalance because of the total metabolic compensation.
Okay, so that's everything to do with pH as far as our class is concerned. Now, in our last lecture, the lecture coming up next, we're going to be doing a case study that kind of summarizes everything from the last two chapters that we've covered, pH and urinary. And in one of your practice assignments for this block, there is a case study for a man with severe diarrhea or prolonged diarrhea. Go ahead and try to do that before watching the next lecture. Because in the next lecture, we're going to do that case study. But rather than just sitting and watching me do it and writing my answers down, it's best if you try to do it yourself first to see if you understand it, and then checking your answers against the correct answers. Okay? Well, I hope that all made sense today. Like I said, it can be fun if you let it be fun. Try to do some of those in your bonus assignments, practice assignments area for this block. There are a lot of those ABG. So work through some of those and see if you can get them. All right. Take care, and I will talk to you in our next and last lecture for Bio 139.